Hi, welcome back. I wanted to do a bit of a follow-up to last week's video. I was talking about kind of left-wing ideologies being very aggressive and how that can have a detrimental effect to the left and to society in general. This week we've seen the trans debate going on in court has come to an end, and they've decided regarding the Equality Act in England that the gender of people will be decided by their biological sex, not by whichever gender that they have personally selected. That has caused huge waves in the LGBTQ plus community, and it's caused some celebration on the other side of things. And I don't really want to get into a kind of one side's right, one side's wrong kind of thing, but I do have some interesting input into this, and it comes in terms of a safety aspect to do with children. And it's something that we've actually got some personal experience with, and it's something that the left have told us definitely doesn't happen, and I actually have personal experience to say it does happen. I've witnessed it. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that experience and some of my concerns around the trans issue. And my concerns aren't with people being trans. I don't care what people want to be, if they want to display themselves in a different way, whatever they choose. I don't care if they want to walk around in an animal suit, as long as it's not causing harm to people or their ideology isn't forced onto people, which then goes on to be able to cause harm. And that's kind of what I'm addressing in this video. So we had a situation with a very close family member, a young girl, and I'll give a bit of background. As most young teenagers, from the age of sort of 10 to 13, it's quite a difficult age for young people, especially young girls. There's a lot of pressure on them. This particular young girl was trying to, get in with friendship groups. She wasn't being very successful. She had a little bit of a habit of kind of making stories up to make herself sound more exciting and more impressive. Some of the stories were kind of unusual. She would say, she had been brought up in a ghetto, or she lived in some sort of creepy abandoned house, all these weird things. But of course the other kids in the school were, pretty quick to guess that this was all made up. They didn't take kindly to it. So she really struggled to settle into a good friendship group, and that caused some problems. At the same time, young people are obviously thinking about their sexuality. I remember being that age and having lots of different thoughts, I was idolising an older boy at my school who was really good at sports, and thinking to myself, does that mean I love him? Because at those ages you don't even understand what love is or what sexuality really feels like. You're kind of padding everything out. And then as you get older, you start kind of growing into it. But it's perfectly normal for young people to have a series of different feelings and kind of try and experience some of them, maybe not, but they're just kind of getting used to themselves, and it's not really for adults, I don't think, to step in and try and influence that in any one way or another. As long as they're not hurting themselves, you let them get on with having their own experience of finding their sexuality. So you had all that going on, and this young girl was then at a situation where she's quite vulnerable because she's not fitting in with her friendship groups, and she's beginning to let's say experiment with different types of sexuality. So at one point she has a young boyfriend, and as far as we're concerned it was just holding hands and whatever kids do at that age, not a big deal. And then she has a girlfriend, because that became very popular for kids of that age at school to be in the part of this LGBTQ plus group. That kind of wave, became a very popular thing. Now, it was also possible that she was gay, so I wouldn't take that away. But what made me think she probably wasn't, because, a few weeks later when she then fell out with that girl, she then changed into something again, and she became something where she said she wasn't any sexuality. And then we started going through like a gamut of different sexualities, let's say, all with different names, most of which I'd never even heard of. But every couple of weeks this would kind of come up as, this is what I am, and we would say fine, because it didn't really, you know, affect us in any way. And this went on for a while. At one point, this became more about gender, and we were then told, you know, that she wanted to change gender, that she wanted to be known by a different name and all that kind of stuff. Now, we had gone through a lot of these different changes, so we were kind of getting a little bit bored of being kind of asked to corroborate all these different things, but we weren't particularly saying she couldn't do any of it. You know, we were just like leaving her to it, but we weren't going to change our behaviour around the house, and that caused a bit of consternation. But the biggest problem came when we actually found that she had been talking to people online, and these people were, so they said, part of the trans community, and they were lobbying her to kind of join them, to become trans, to do lots of different things basically that would change her life forever. So these were adults, by the way. They were probably from 20 years old to say 50 years old in these groups that she was discussing with online. We managed to get a look at all this stuff, and we actually heard some very disturbing conversations happening. That's how we kind of twigged on that we actually heard some of this going on. These older people, you know, were talking to what was then a 13-year-old girl and suggesting, you know, that she should get all this different stuff going on, whether it be taking certain drugs to block hormones, whether it be to get surgery, whether it be to strap certain body parts down with really tight tape, buy certain strapping types of clothing to do the same thing. But more disturbing was that they were asking for graphically detailed information about her sex life, about her body, and in essence this was a 40-something-year-old man, so he's like my age, asking a 13-year-old girl, you know, whether she's ever had certain types of intercourse, whether she could describe those things in detail, and that is highly disturbing. Now, this 40-something-year-old man is masquerading, I would say, as one of the trans community. Maybe he is one of the trans community, but we can't rule out the fact he may be just using the whole trans ideology as a vehicle to be able to get to young girls in a way that they feel comfortable to reveal some of these graphic things to him. And I 100% witnessed that, and that actually caused huge problems within the family. You know, it caused a lot of problems, and it has probably changed that young girl's life forever. Now, my big problem with the very aggressive and politicized sort of LGBTQ plus community is that we've moved on from having a supportive community that, say if you were a young person and you felt that you were gay, and many years ago you may not have had anyone that you could turn to, and that would be a big problem, right? I don't want anyone to be in that situation. Like I've talked about before, I was brought up in and around Brighton. I had many gay friends, gay family members, and I would hate to think of any of them feeling lonely, like they couldn't discuss things that were really worrying them. So I'm glad we've moved on from that, and we're able to provide a support network. But that is what it should be, a support network if people want support, and it should be like an unbiased support network, especially if it's adults supporting children. You know, it's akin to if you send a child to a psychologist, the psychologist wouldn't already have a preconceived opinion of what was wrong with that child. The psychologist would allow that to slowly permeate, and it could take months or even years for, you know, that to actually come out and show itself. But we're in a situation at the moment where we have adults that are politically motivated. They're motivated by this almost religious zealot-like situation where they're really lobbying for kind of new blood into their crew, and they're very keen to attract vulnerable young people into it. I think because obviously having more people within their group gives them some power, and you cannot deny that there is going to be some members of that group who are probably not trans people. They're probably just perverted paedophiles that have seen this as an ideal way to get at young people and to use the trans banner over them as a kind of protection, because people are frightened. You know, if you accused any one of those people in that group of being anything other than perfectly nice and doing nice trans things, then we're in a situation where you could get cancelled, you could get charged with maybe a hate crime. So it provides the ideal cover. Now, I've heard the left say this just doesn't happen. You know, you don't get paedophiles pretending to be trans parading around in restrooms and stuff. Well, I can tell you now that that absolutely did happen, even back in the day when I worked security in Brighton, that we did see that. You know, that was not a regular thing, but it certainly happened. And as I've just explained, I've certainly seen with my own eyes men on the internet, what I would call grooming a young child, but using the veil of trans to kind of get away with it. And whether they're trans or not, I would still argue that talking to a child in that manner when you're that age is no doubt a form of grooming, because to help a young child with their gender issues, you don't need to ask them detailed stuff about their sex life. That has no bearing on any of the subject matter at all. So I find it really disingenuous when members of that community say this never happens, because I know for a fact that it does happen. And even if it happens in a small amount of cases, you know, the primary motivating factor for a society should be to protect children at all costs. You know, we're talking about putting the rights of adults to save their feelings, you know, to not hurt their feelings, above the safety of children, even if it's only a few children. And if we're talking about numbers, you know, you say, well, it might only be a tiny amount of paedophiles that would utilize the movement for that. Well, then the movement itself is only a tiny amount of numbers in terms of the rest of society. So if we're just not going to bother doing things based on the fact it's only a small percentage, then why are we talking about this at all? You know, we might as well just say we won't do anything for these minority groups. But we obviously want to be as accommodating to people as possible. I understand that. But we shouldn't be accommodating adults when it puts children at further risk. And I would argue at the moment that some of this aggressive messaging and this kind of ideology and this zealot-like need for adults to kind of enroll children into their brand or group, that to me is deeply disturbing. I mean, some of those children may be gay, for example. You know, I knew plenty of young people my age when we were growing up that felt that they might be gay. Now, that was quite a long time ago, but if that happened now, I would imagine a large percentage of them would probably get persuaded you're not gay, you're actually, you know, a different gender. That just didn't exist really when I was 13, 14, so it didn't tend to happen. There were a couple of kids at my school that clearly had a massive hormonal imbalance, and it was very likely that they would feel that they were born in the wrong body, because there was a boy that was clearly more like a girl. You know, he obviously had a lot of estrogen, very little testosterone, a medical kind of abnormality, and I would completely understand that he would want to act and dress and be a girl, basically, and the same for a girl that was at the school. But there just wasn't any pressure. You know, if you were a boy that liked boys, no one was trying to persuade you that that meant you were actually a girl. If you were a girl that was a tomboy that liked to play with boys' toys and be in the football team and whatever, no one was trying to say, oh, you must be a boy then. You know, people just accepted that everyone was different and there was varying degrees of everything. It was, I think, a lot more of an accepting time then than it actually is now, because now it's like everyone has to fit in some sort of box. You can't just be an individual. You know, you have to bracket yourself and say, right, that person is this gender, that person is this sexuality. And, you know, frankly, in the 80s, no one gave a damn in my area There was probably a lot more homophobia then. Thank God that's been pushed out, and that should have been the main focus of these groups within this kind of rainbow banner. The focus should have been to eradicate violence against them, to eradicate abuse against them, whether it be verbal or physical, and to have an equal playing field, pretty much. So, you know, the rights of gay couples to get married, for example. And I completely support all of that. I don't see why they should be judged any differently to anyone else. I've got no issues with any of that. But I do have an issue where we're allowing this situation where children are being kind of lobbied in order to be a certain way, and that's moved into the classrooms to the point that we did have a very, very small percentage of people that would say that they were a different gender. That was a tiny percentage. Now in some classes you've got 10, 15, 20% of the class that are saying either yes, they have felt that they're a different gender, or they're becoming a different gender, or they think they might in the future. So a huge leap, and I don't believe that anything crazy has happened. You know, we haven't had any sort of medical changes, we haven't had anything that would influence that, other than it's the zeitgeist. You know, it's the fashion at the moment for kids to jump on that bandwagon, just like it was fashionable a few years ago to grow your hair really long, or to be into punk music, or whatever it was. We've gone through all these different stages, and I think we've gone through so many stages now that it's got more and more extreme, to the point that we're now talking about it's really fashionable to get attention by saying that you're a different gender. And I think, like I said, some of those people are legitimately trans, you know, that there will be a percentage that are, and I think a lot are not. I think a lot are utilising it as a tool for attention, and I think a lot of people are utilising it as a tool to seek power. I mean, imagine the power that you would wield in a school as a young person if you can suddenly demand your teacher calls you something different, you know, and if he doesn't call you the right thing, you can call him out on it, and no one's going to tell you off for that. You know, you're in the right, the teacher's in the wrong. It's kind of a balance of power thing. So I can see how that would be very attractive to young people. And also, like I described with that young girl, that most young people feel kind of disenfranchised. They feel that they don't fit in. You know, we've all probably been through a phase in our lives where we felt like that, even sometimes as adults. And when you don't fit in, suddenly there's a community there that says, we'll accept you, and you can be anything you like in this community. You can basically say anything you like, as long as it's fulfilling the community narrative on certain things. But you can basically say that you're an animal, or, you know, any gender, whatever, any sexuality, and we're going to all praise you for it. We're going to say that you're a hero, and we're going to be really, really nice to you. That's almost like a cult. So that kind of concerns me, that we're happily watching this occur and people are too frightened to talk about some of those possibilities. I think it's a subject that deserves open discussion. I think it's a subject that people shouldn't be frightened to talk about in a non-aggressive, non-abusive way. There's nothing, you know, I think the left are very keen that as soon as anyone discusses these subjects, that the left will suddenly jump in screaming and say, you're a homophobe, or you're a transphobe, you're a racist, whatever it is, to shut the situation down, to shut that conversation down. It's not transphobic, homophobic, or racist to have intelligent discussions about those subjects if you're not being abusive to people. You know, it's okay for adults to question these things and to have a two-way conversation. You know, and as parents, we have a right to ask questions about the health and safety of the children, right? You know, we shouldn't be in a situation where parents are frightened to talk to their school about some of these things because they don't want to be labelled as someone who's some kind of phobic. So I really want to see a more open discussion. I get very suspicious with the left when they want to shut all open discussion down and just scream back in your face or get you cancelled That makes me more and more suspicious of their motives, because people with good motives and pure, kind motives don't shut discussions down. People that have really good, pure motives are happy to engage on that subject matter. They're happy to have a two-way conversation. If you asked me about anything that I do in my life, I would happily talk to you about it. I wouldn't start screaming at you. Even if you told me you didn't like some of the things that I do in my life, if you said, I don't like that you're straight, I think that that's ridiculous and you shouldn't be straight, I'm not going to get upset about that. I don't like that you present yourself as a man. I'm not going to get upset about that. I don't like that you're white. I'm not going to get upset about that. I'll have a conversation about those issues, or you might pick some of the hobbies or the things I choose to do. None of that's going to get me particularly upset. I'm happy to talk about it, and I'm happy to try and persuade you, that I'm doing something that's decent and normal. So when someone doesn't want to do that, I begin to get very, very suspicious indeed. So I think this needs closer examination by people, and I believe that we should be steering away from this kind of zealot-like approach, and that is made worse by the extreme right, by the way, that the more you kind of vilify and abuse these sections of community, the more that they're going to use that and be aggressive back. And again, we've got this polarizing situation occurring where we've got two extreme sides of the debate that are both screaming. They're both commanding media attention, because the media will never give attention to the boring middle ground. They will always give attention to the extreme sides of this debate. And that will continue, and the more you kind of vilify someone, the more they disappear and become more and more zealot-like. They kind of hide under the rocks, and you don't want a situation where you're pushing those people into a corner. At the same time, we don't want a situation as it exists at the moment where there's a possibility at least of children being endangered. I've heard the left talk about this when what they would call people on the right have said, we don't like the idea of men in women's changing rooms, which to a degree the law, the Equality Act, may be changing some of that in England this week, because there's already been companies saying that they're going to change their policies in terms of things like women's changing rooms. The left has said it's ridiculous to say that trans people are going to go into women's changing rooms and be abusive. And that may be so, that trans people may not be abusive in those changing rooms, but I can guarantee there will be an element of men who are abusive men who see the trans movement as a vehicle to carry out their abusive tactics. I mean, if you look at men that abuse children, they will go as far as to get a job in a school. They will go as far as to get jobs in social services and work their way up. So these people are very, very dedicated and will spend a lot of time and a lot of energy to be able to abuse children and go undetected. And now they've got this really easy route, and you're really telling me that they're not going to utilise that easy route of just donning a wig, changing their name, and basically saying, right, now I can, kind of do what I want and no one can really challenge me, because if they do, I'm going to be deeply offended, and then I'm going to point at them and get them cancelled, and the police are going to be scared to deal with them because, the police don't want the heat of dealing with these very contentious issues. So I think it's naive to believe that that situation would never occur, and I've also seen situations like that occur. I've definitely seen men who I doubt very much were truly trans that were basically utilising that situation to try and get themselves into women's spaces and to do unpleasant stuff, at least to be verbally abusive and to kind of flash themselves to the women at the very least. I would be fascinated to hear what you guys think in the comments. Please do keep it clean. You did really well in the last video. Thank you to everyone for commenting. People were just posting nice, intelligent stuff. No one descended into abuse or anything like that. as soon as that happens, I will start removing those commenters, and if people really get problematic in the comments, I will actually turn the comments off, because I just don't have the time to police them to the nth degree. But I trust that people are going to use this as a pleasant two-way debate. I'm sure I will get people on both sides of the coin commenting here. I welcome both sides of the coin, you know, to have an opinion. But again, whichever side you are, don't just come here screaming and shouting and saying abusive stuff, because I'm just going to remove it, and it won't be a comment section for you to push an agenda either. If you're here to push some kind of ideology or political agenda, then I will get rid of those too, because this is not the place for you. This is a place for intelligent conversation. Thank you very much for watching. Take care. I'll catch you all next time.